The defining feature of Protopalatial pottery was the polychrome-styled Kamares wares. If you ever walk through any Cretan museum, you will quickly notice a sudden turn towards homogeneity amongst Cretan pottery when you enter the Protopalatial period. The fine wares with a combined red, white and/or yellowish-brown decoration on a black background were first found by the Kamares cave just north of Phaistos, by the south slopes of the Siluritis mountains. It is the same cold cave which can be seen when peering north from the central court at Phaistos. As Kamares wares are a feature of the Protopalatial period, these polychrome wares are first produced around the Middle Minoan 1b period. But as we discussed previously, there are various examples of polychrome wares from the late Prepalatial period. So why differentiate between these wares? To some degree, it is a question of convenience, chronology, and craftsmanship. In the strictest of terms, Kamares wares are commonly luxury vessels in a polychrome light on dark style, produced during the Protopalatial period, featuring complex and vibrant designs, often of either geometric, abstract, or naturalistic motifs, while also exhibiting excellent craftsmanship. Kamares wares established another development in pottery production. These fine wares were becoming an essential part in the luxury consumption of the palaces, and we might say that Kamares wares served much the same function as other prestige items, namely status. In comparison to previous polychrome wares, we see a large variety of designs, implementing some new motifs inspired by nature. What's also fascinating is the degree of artistical freedom afforded to these artisans at these specialized workshops which produce Kamares wares. No single vessel is identical to another. They may share similar patterns or motifs, but each piece of pottery is unique. Probably the most drastic change of the period is the introduction of the potter's wheel, a technological advance which allowed for increased symmetry, more complex shapes, and thinner walls of the vessels. By the early Protopalatial period, both hand and wheel-made wares are found together. But as the Protopalatial period proceeds, we find a strong shift towards the potter's wheel, and especially large-scale production, utilizing the efficiency and benefits of the wheel. We can especially see the result of this advancement in pottery technology and production when studying the thin walls of the aptly named eggshell wares of the Middle Minoan II period. They are generally small cups with the polychrome light on dark Kamares color scheme, with very thin walls, at times no thicker than a few millimeters, which is why the wares were termed eggshell wares. Another advent of the Middle Minoan II period is the increased size of vessels produced in the Kamares style. Initially, during the Middle Minoan 1b, Kamares wares were mostly restricted to smaller or medium-sized vessels, such as jugs, cups, pitchers, bowls, and so on. These vessels were commonly created either by hand or by wheel, but during the Middle Minoan II period, we find large vessels, amphoras, pithois, and jars, all in the Kamares style decoration. If we compare polychrome wares from the Middle Minoan 1 and 2 period, we find some developments in terms of artistic expression. In the Middle Minoan 1 period, it is mostly the combination of red and white geometric patterns which are produced, although there is some regional variation as the polychrome style of wares are produced all over Crete. But what signifies the Middle Minoan II period, so the second half of the Protopalatial period, is the introduction of both new pigments and motifs. Especially the increased use of brown and orange decoration as it becomes much more common, introducing a more nuanced decoration, which allows for a less harsh contrast than the combination of red and white decoration used during the Middle Minoan 1 period. So it is not unexpected that it is during the Middle Minoan II period that we find the most impressive examples of polychrome Kamares pottery. But it is not only the use of colors, variation in design, technological development, and the noticeable skill of the artisans which makes the Middle Minoan II Kamares wares such a high point in Minoan material culture. It is also now that the pottery decoration starts to move towards naturalism. We find various wares decorated with motifs from the natural world, chiefly with either a floral motif or a marine motif, such as octopuses or fishes. The floral motifs are chiefly flower petals in various forms, some decorated with branches and others with flower garlands running around the vessel. The most elaborate vessel depicting the marine style of Kamares wares is this Middle Minoan 2 example from Phaistos. It depicts a fish struggling with the net of a fisherman, and running around the lower half of the base we find decorations illustrating the wind and waves of the open sea. We have seen some of these motifs featured earlier, like these polychrome jugs with fishes in white decoration from Castro found in eastern Crete, but it is during the Protopalatial that these motifs becomes much more defined and common. While the production of Kamares wares cease around the end of the Protopalatial period, these motifs will remain in style throughout the Neopalatial period as well. It is this interest amongst the Minoans to depict the natural world around them and not individual Minoans which has led to the romanticization of Minoan lifestyle and worldview. Regarded as in tune with nature, less inclined to violence and more civilized than their Mycenaean counterparts on mainland Greece. We certainly know now that the Minoans were by no means opposed to violence, but there is something to be said about their depictions of nature. In terms of artistic motifs, the Minoans themselves are nearly completely absent. Only a few scenes from religious processions or cult activities gives us any greater insight into how the Minoans viewed themselves. The most elaborate and extravagant examples of Kamares wares can be found at Phaistos, the so-called royal service, a pottery set intended for use at the palatial banquets amongst the palace elite. Now, what set these wares apart is not just the detailed use of colours and plethora of patterns, but the relief decoration. The best example of relief decoration can be found on this crater from the royal service, where full relief flowers are added to the exterior of the vessel. The crater would have been filled with wine and then probably diluted with water to reduce the strength of the wine before the banquet participants filled their cups for the communal feasting. The other pieces of the royal service includes a large pouring jug sharing the same checkboard patterns and encircling fawns as the crater, but also a large fruit bowl and a stand intended for supporting any vessel placed on it. Kamares wares generally take the spotlight when it comes to Protopalatial pottery, and understandably so, but various other forms of pottery was also produced, and with the introduction of the potter's wheel, there is a noticeable increase in pottery production and also the quality of wares. Sadly, the interest in ceramic wares had a negative effect on the production of wares made out of stones, which had been a staple of Cretan artisans during the pre-palatial period. Just consider some of the pre-palatial stone jugs from Moklos, which we discussed before. Stonewares certainly aren't absent during the period, but a shift towards ceramic production is noticeable. A form of item which deviates from other ceramic wares around the period are ceramic pieces which aim to emulate the shape of contemporary metallic vessels. For example, at the town of Gornia, an impressive silver kantharos, a form of wine cup or chalice, had been found which must have been imported from Anatolia. As stated many times before, valuable metals are completely absent on Crete, so instead of reproducing the item in metal, we find local production of imitation wares, wares mimicking the metal shape of the Anatolian style kantharos but sculpted in clay. On some pottery we find a rather odd prickly exterior which can be seen on some Middle Minoan 1A pottery but becomes very common around the next period, the Middle Minoan 2 period. These are wares with a so-called barbotine relief decoration, where the exterior has had dots of additional clay added to the surface and then brushed or sculpted to create a spiny, prickly look. The decoration is commonly used on medium or small polychrome jugs. The style of the relief decoration varies heavily depending on the vessel, so there is no universal pattern. Instead, it seemed very much up to the artisan, with some applying the decoration symmetrically along the surface of the vessel, while others are less systematic in their application. Minoan fine Kamares wares were not only appreciated amongst the elite on Crete, They became popular export items to nearby cultures, both within and outside the Aegean. The Protopalatial is in many ways a new era in Minoan trade and expansion. The Minoan sphere of influence expanded beyond the small island as the palace economy necessitated increased trade. The increase in trade and expansion around the period can be explained both through internal and external factors. Internal factors are chiefly related to the advent of the palace economy and the consumption of luxury goods amongst an elite class. But probably the main driving factor was the need for copper and tin. This was to forge the bronze which created the tools which built the palaces and bolstered the economy, as well as the weapons which armed the soldiers. The material demand of the palace elite brought various forms of valuables to Crete: silver, gold, copper, tin, ivory, and of course various fine wares. The outside factors are connected to the state of the Eastern Mediterranean around the start of the Protopalatial period. Egypt, which had spent more than a century of internal conflict during the first intermediate period, had been unified under the so-called Middle Kingdom, and therefore had acquired newfound prosperity around the time of the construction of the first palaces. With Egypt re-entering a new period of stability, demand and supply around the Eastern Mediterranean once again grew. The multiple cities along the Levant, such as Byblos, Ugarit, Katna and Ebla, all played a pivotal role in trading exotic wares and valuable metals from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, and of course vice versa. At the Middle Bronze Age, Cyprus, with its production of copper, also started to integrate into the wider trade network of the Near East. So when the Minoans enter the Protopalatial period and the first palaces are constructed, an extensive network of trade was already established east of the island. The fact that Minoan wares now appear within this trade context certainly indicates that Crete under the palace economy took an increased interest in trade. So how would trade around this greater trade network look like for the Minoans? Well, it is quite probable that many of the wares which eventually ended up on Crete had traded hands with various traders before ending up in the hands of Cretan traders. Cyprus, for example, stands out as a springboard to the Near East for the Cretans, and by the time of the Protopalatial period, multiple Minoan wares had started to show up in Cyprus, and in return, Cypriot wares and copper were traded to the Cretans. The trade cities along the Levant were deeply connected to the greater trade network around Mesopotamia, and from the nearby Mari and Assyrian trade networks, tin and copper, along with precious gems such as lapis lazuli, amethyst, and agates from distant land could easily be acquired. In return for these resources, Cretan merchants brought fine textiles, cloth, pottery, purple dye, wine, olive oil, and spices such as saffron. It is also in the trade records we find an indication of what name the Minoans were known as in the Near East. One of the Mari trade tablets from the turn of the 19th century BC details a shipment of tin sent to Kaptar or Kaptara, a land generally believed to be Crete, being the same land as the biblical Kaftor, home of the Philistines, or the land of the people the Egyptians called Kiftiu, described as the people from the island of the Great Green by the Egyptians, the Great Green referring to the Mediterranean. The Minoans had quite an interest in luxury wares and items with Egyptian motifs. Much of what had been found imported from Egypt connects to luxury consumption: gems, gold, pottery, stonewares and figurines. We find many wares with Egyptian relief decoration and motifs imported to Crete: scarabs, monkeys, griffins, sphinxes and bees. In return, the Egyptian traders, like most other traders, appreciated Cretan pottery, purple dye, textiles, oils and spices. It wasn't only the Minoans who had an interest in Egyptian culture. The interest seemed mutual, as Minoan pottery had been found throughout all of Lower and Upper Egypt, from the Nile Delta as far as Aswan. The same would probably have been true of Minoan textiles if they weren't perishable materials. Around the Aegean, Minoan pottery and wares show up far and wide. Minoan ships left the many ports of the Cretan coast, sailing north with the ambition of finding metals, gemstones, fine wares and textiles. The ships would have taken various routes north, but many would have made their way west along the coast to the small island of Kythera and Kythera, trading at Castri before reaching the Helladic cities along the Peloponnese. Tiryns, Lerna, Mycenae, Aegina, just to name a few. Reaching Attica, silver and copper from the rich mines at Lavrion were a sought-after commodity amongst the Minoan traders. Some then continued north to the port of Iolkos before crossing the Aegean, reaching the Anatolian coast and the Dodecanese islands, trading with Troy, Miletus, Samos and Iassos, where pottery and textiles could be traded for gold, silver and copper, which is plentiful around Anatolia. Then heading back, passing by the island of Rhodes. Other trade routes headed south after Attica, along the Cycladic islands, trading with various Cycladic towns on their way back to Crete. The lack of any other potent power around the Aegean during the Middle Bronze Age allowed for the Minoans to exercise noticeable influence around the Aegean and push for controlling areas outside of Crete. Securing access of resources unavailable on Crete must have been the impetus for this shift towards the outside world. Initially, Minoan influence comes through mercantile power, with many Aegean settlements and cultures dependent on Minoan wares and commodities, but also dependent on the Minoans to buy their wares. It is quite likely that wealthy elites on the small Cycladic islands found the Minoan customs and wares very fashionable and wished to emulate them, in a similar manner as the Minoans emulated Egyptian and Eastern customs. As a result, we start to see a form of Minoanizing of the Aegean, which starts during the Protopalatial but will continue until the late Minoan, what we might call the creation of a Minoan cultural sphere. At the island of Kythera, which sits like an intermediary between the Minoans and the Helladic cultures on mainland Greece, we find the first example of Minoan colonization. It seems as if the settlement at Castri was established by the Minoans around the beginning of the Middle Minoan period and remained so until the late Minoan. And there even exists a peak sanctuary just outside the settlement, where Minoan votive offerings have been found which are similar to those found at peak sanctuaries on Crete. Minoan colonies around the Aegean will become a feature of the Neopalatial period, but for the Protopalatial, the colony at Castri is quite unique, indicating that Minoan ambitions had expanded beyond the island.